Hello, my name is JeeYeun Lee. I am an artist in Chicago in the US, a place also known as Jekagoinak in the Potawatomi language. This is part of the territory of the Potawatomi people, as well as the Ojibwe and Odawa, other nations of the Council of Three Fires. Other indigenous nations have made this their home as well, including the Illinois, Miami, Sauk, Meskwaki, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee peoples, as well as all the native people who make this their home today, representing over 100 tribal nations. I also want to recognize that the technology that allows me to record this and you to watch it is only possible by material resources and people's labor from many parts of the world. Just a couple of examples. One is copper. Used in circuit boards, 1/3 of the world's copper is mined in Chile. Half of the world's cobalt used in batteries comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where child labor and hazardous working conditions fuel profits used by the government and armed militia to buy weapons in a 15-year ongoing conflict. Place has always been important to me. By the time I turned 18, I had lived in 12 homes in 8 cities of 5 countries on 3 continents, traveling roughly from east to west on this map. So place, as well as its connected issues of migration, national status, colonization, and language, among others, has been a focus of my work. I started as a fiber artist, which I think is related to the field of walking and place in its concerns about material, labor, repetition, and the engagement of the body. My work in these last few years has been about being in, knowing, learning about, and feeling a place. I'm specifically interested in place from the point of view of what has been repressed or suppressed or unacknowledged in histories that erupt and make themselves visible in the present. One theoretical framework that has been useful for me is critical place inquiry, developed by Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck and Marcia McKenzie. This framework recognizes the following: that places are mobile, shifting over time and through interactions with people, other species, and social practices, that places influence social practices as well as being performed through practices of individuals and groups. That disparate realities determine not only how place is experienced, but also how it is understood and practiced in relation to culture, geography, gender, race, sexuality, age, or other identifications and experiences. Critical place inquiry addresses place-based processes of colonization and settler colonization. It extends beyond the social to consider the land itself and its non-human inhabitants as they determine and manifest place, and it contains a relational ethics of accountability to people and place. My main medium for witnessing place is through walking as a way to understand and feel. I view walking as a way to process the histories of a place through my body. This project, Walking Detroit, was how I started walking as a creative practice. It was primarily a project looking at racism in metropolitan areas, specifically in Detroit metropolitan area. But as I got deeper into it, it became clear that the basis for these dynamics were laid in the foundation of the U.S. as a nation state, in colonization and genocide, the whole idea of settler colonialism. The project itself consisted of walking 5 roads that radiate out from downtown Detroit, laid out on trails created by Native peoples. I walked on them for 25 miles each, a distance that passes through the city of Detroit, as well as into the suburbs and beyond the suburbs. While I walked, I wore a Korean garment made of denim, a tribute to the themes of this project. Denim embodies the materiality of slavery and colonization, since it was enslaved Africans who carried the knowledge of indigo cultivation to the United States, which makes the denim blue, and cotton, the fabric itself, was one of the world's first commodities to fuel capitalism, grown by enslaved Africans on land stolen from indigenous peoples. These walks took me past luxury mansions on private roads and gated communities to industrial areas and what some people would call the inner city. Often I saw both on the same road, separated by mere miles. With very few pedestrians, the sidewalk sometimes ended arbitrarily. Art and signage decorated some of the buildings, while others were simply gleaming monuments to capital and development. I walked a few case studies of some suburbs that allowed me to witness the dynamics of suburbanization as a form of settler colonialism. Their boundaries were defined to displace, replace, and exclude. My walking was itself a form of embodied research, which I supplemented with more traditional research in archives, libraries, and interviews. What I was witnessing in Detroit was a story that began long before European settlers came, when these were the homelands of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. The French came first as settlers to trade and to marry into native networks until they were replaced by the British and then the Americans. In the 1700s, about 2/3 of the native population in Michigan died from diseases that white people brought. In the Detroit area, from 1795 to 1842, native peoples were forced off their land through 6 treaties and 1 act of Congress. The building of the Erie Canal and of railroads set the stage for European immigrants to migrate from the East Coast to Detroit. But the real driver of settlement and population growth came in the early 1900s through the auto industry. African Americans came to Detroit as part of the Great Migration, the mass movement of about 5 million African Americans from the South to the North and the West between 1910 and 1970. They were recruited by auto companies who needed labor, and then recruited by the defense industry during World War I and World War II. But when African Americans came to Detroit, they were confined to a few enclaves by laws and official practices that included segregation ordinances, restrictive covenants, and redlining. Redlining was the basis of the modern mortgage system in the US, with maps created by the federal government to determine which neighborhoods were likely to be good investments for mortgage lenders. Predominantly Black neighborhoods were always marked red. Official policies designed to encourage racial segregation in housing were buttressed by systematic violence and harassment by white people against African Americans. But still, as African American residents and community leaders fought the segregationist laws, they were able to move out from their enclaves. So over time, between 1940 to 2000, here's what the maps looked like. The green areas are predominantly African American, the yellow is white. This is 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980. Pink is where Hispanic and Latino people started to settle, 1990 and 2000. So as you can see, there was a great shift in the racial makeup of the city of Detroit in that time. So what happened to the white people? Where did they go? They went to the suburbs. So this, in 1921, was the footprint of the Detroit metropolitan area, including both the city and the suburbs. In 1921, 1935, 1968, 1987, and 2009. Some of this research and reflections about Detroit are narrated in a video that I created about this project. The excerpt of the transcript is shown here, and it is also part of a book that I published about the entirety of this project. All of the information I'm talking about here is on my website, as well as in this book, and the link will be shared at the end of this presentation. I have also made socially engaged projects for others to walk. This piece was about Cranbrook, an educational institution based in the suburbs of Detroit. It consisted of an installation of an altered map of the Cranbrook campus. The land that Cranbrook is on was first bought by white settlers in 1823. George Booth, who had made his money in journalism, bought it in 1904 and named it Cranbrook after his family's hometown in Kent, England. He bought it first to be a gentleman farmer, but then changed his mind and demolished all of the farm buildings to build an educational institution instead. This image is of a map that he used for the first 25 years after he bought the property to plan what he wanted on the 300-acre estate, all in pencil, so that he could draw what he wanted and erase it as he changed his mind. This happened so much that it was called the Erasure's Plan. I took the liberty of erasing further. The interactive component was a walk route around the campus with an audio guide. What follows is an excerpt from the audio narrative, with archival images as well as documentation from a group walk.
George Booth worked with 2 landscape architects to design the property. H.J. Corfield worked in the first few years after Booth bought the land, creating the basic plan for many of the early roads and the first set of farm buildings located near what is now Kingswood School. Corfield also helped to shape and plant the shorelines and islands of the lake. O.C. Simons, the second landscape architect, worked intermittently from 1910 to 1923. He designed the shrub and forest plantings, starting with the slopes between Cranbrook House and the lake in 1910. He then planted 4,000 pines around the Greek Theater in 1916. At that point, Booth asked him to come up with an overall plan for the property. This plan included large areas of forestation, using between 200 and 4,000 trees of 45 different species, with an average of 1,000 each. He favored naturalistic groupings of native shrubs and trees, and liked to mix the species at the edges of forest areas to provide the effect of a more natural edge. In all, over 150,000 trees were planted during Booth's lifetime. Kyle White, Potawatomi. One should not underestimate the physicality and scale of the U.S. settler homeland creation process. Europeans and eventually U.S. Americans had to physically shape the lands and waters to reflect their future aspirations and fears, economic systems, cultures, ways of life, and heritages. They literally had to carve out or inscribe a homeland for themselves within a territory whose ecosystems were already coupled with the social, political, and cultural institutions of different populations. Moreover, for many people who want a territory to be a homeland for themselves, they have to be able to claim it as a place. That is, they have to make themselves believe that they are the indigenous inhabitants of that region. So the homeland process involves the creation or adaptation of stories, customs, histories, and so on that justify settlers' own desires to have the right to live there and to make their occupation an inevitable part of their heritage and future trajectory.
I was thinking a lot about land, colonization, the formation of the U.S., and what that means for the structure of things now. I was also thinking about what it means to be from a formerly colonized country, an immigrant here in the U.S., here because of U.S. imperialism, now being used in the project of settler colonialism. I had the chance to be in Santa Fe, New Mexico for several months and think about those questions in a completely differently colonized part of the U.S. Everything is different between Detroit and Santa Fe, the landscape, the people, the history, but they are similar in that they were doubly colonized, the Spanish there, the French and British here, and then both again by the U.S. I was really trying to think about decolonization. What does it look like? What does it entail? How does it become real and not just a metaphor? If it's not about all the settlers leaving, and maybe it is, then what is it? All the places on this continent are good places to think about decolonization, but Santa Fe is a place where things are not far under the surface. Santa Fe was the seat of colonial administration, starting with the Spanish to Mexico, to when it became a U.S. territory, and to when it achieved U.S. statehood. It's also a place where Native people organized and drove the Spanish out for 12 years. I walked 2 roads there that figure in the history of colonization. The first one, El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, was the first European road in North America, and for a century it was the longest. It was the route by which the Spanish took from Mexico City up to this part of the world for settlement. These are some of the images from along the route of the walk. Part of it is now part of the National Park Service. The other road that I walked was the Santa Fe Trail. Founded in the early 1820s on the tracks of native trails and driven by the lure of lucrative trading opportunities with New Mexico, the trail quickly grew into a major commercial thoroughfare that transported merchandise, livestock, and people across nearly 900 miles and through lands that belonged to at least 12 distinct native nations, including the Osage, the Kaw, the Pawnees, Comanches, Kiowas, Apaches, and Pecos Pueblo.
안녕하세요. 제 이름은 이지연입니다. 이 땅을 옛날부터 지키고 있는 태화 사람들과 탄화 사람들에게 존중하고 감사드립니다. Walking the tracks of the Santa Fe Trail and El Camino Real from the plaza heart of colonial bureaucracy back in the direction of the invaders, the traders, the settlers, a landscape of irreconcilable facts. People killed, conquered, and humiliated. Is it better to be killed and die, or to live humiliated, enslaved, raped, forced to submit, forced to leave lands who were family so others could live on them? Others like me. Here in this country that occupied and manipulated mine, that made an agreement so another could colonize and take. How could I take and occupy here? Bad colonizer, bad. And yet there is no outside. Among the Spanish, Jews fleeing the Inquisition, colonizer and colonized mixed, with and without consent, with and without acknowledgement, colonized again, borders yanked and fortified, buffalo soldiers, fresh memories of slavery, seeking dignity by protecting white settler interests. And even those who became white, even they left war and starvation and forced servitude and violence. What are we to do with the stories of desperate clawing for survival, grief and loss, abandoning home elsewhere to end up here in this place? Here is where we are, here with our untenable inheritance, this landscape of heartbreak, this place that might be home, for some, for all. What are we to do? What are we to do? Walk ourselves off this land, walk ourselves into this land. If we walk long enough, will the land speak to us? If we walk long enough, will we be able to hear? Walk, 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 walk with me, won't you?
I'll talk very briefly about one last project. I did a walking project in Chicago similar to the one in Detroit, walking radial roads built on former native paths. These roads I walked for 20 miles each, starting downtown on the former site of Fort Dearborn in front of a sculpture celebrating white settlers. I documented these walks on Instagram, accompanied by research and images from archives and reading. This one here shows the same redlining map of Chicago and how they set up racially segregated housing patterns into the present. This post was about environmental racism, how the communities around polluted industrial sites such as this terminal are predominantly made up of Black and brown people. A marker for an 1835 encampment of Potawatomi people on their journey west, forced out by the treaties, sits in front of a suburban development where land is still bought by settlers. I also passed by housing complexes that are the product of urban renewal, the 20th century version of displacement of undesired bodies removed to make way for white settlers. And a site of protest against such housing inequities, what others know for baseball, is also the location of the start of an historic 1970s movement by Native Americans in Chicago around housing issues. These are a few of my walking projects. More information about all of them are on my website. Thank you for watching.